Hey everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today we're looking at a recent video Mike Winger made about Graham Oppy. I normally don't dip my toes into this kind of content, but Mike's video ruffled my feathers enough to make me respond. Anyway, let's dig straight into Mike's video, and note that I'm first going to play the entire video at 1.25 times speed, and then we will debrief.
Are you ever shaken by why there are brilliant philosophers of religion like Graham Oppy who are atheist? I sometimes feel like I must be missing out or missing something. I used to be shaken by that. I think that what happens is when we don't understand an issue, we tend to look for people who we respect that we feel like they do understand it. And then we may not really get all their explanations, but we respect, and this isn't a bad thing, right? We respect them enough to go, I'm trusting your judgment here. And when you see somebody who looks like they have good judgment and looks brilliant and well informed on an issue, and they have a conclusion that's different than you, it's totally natural to be like, wait, what if I'm wrong and I don't know what's going on here? Let me just say this to start off with. It's, if nothing else, it's at least a tie. It's at least a tie because there are brilliant, and Graham Oppy is not an internet atheist. He's a brilliant philosopher, highly respected. He's not, and I'm sorry, if you're an atheist on the internet, the stereotype that you have of Christians, that we're all just these ignorant people who don't even know our own Bible, and we're just fundies who don't really think deeply about things. That's how philosophers who are atheists often think about internet atheists, actually. So that's the reality of the situation. But you get guys like Graham Oppy. Now, why is it that I'm not stumbled anymore by this? Why does this not bother me that there's like a brilliant man who's much smarter than me who is an atheist? I'll give you a few reasons. Graham Oppy, to take him as an example, he, to my knowledge, is not the kind of atheist that you're thinking of when most of us say like atheist. He actually thinks there are respectable arguments for God's existence. He just doesn't agree with them. In fact, I listened to a debate between Graham Oppy and, was it Ed Fezer? It was on the ontological argument. I think it was Graham Oppy and Ed Fezer. In this debate, it was really interesting as you listen to it. Most of us would listen and be like, I only understood like 8% of that. And that's fine. I don't mind listening when I don't understand all of a thing. That's kind of how I learn. You just keep listening, even though you don't quite get it all. But what was really interesting was how Graham Oppy says, at the end of the day, and I'll summarize, I'll paraphrase for him. You can see the debate yourself, but he basically says, look, at the end of the day, I have an intuition against God and you have an intuition towards God. And that's that, right? Like that's it. Like that's ultimately why I'm going to land on the atheist side. It's not because my arguments are better or stronger. It's because I have an intuition one way and you have an intuition the other way, which is really trippy because it means that this high up philosopher wasn't like, I have these solid reasons why this is absolutely the case. Not that he doesn't try to marshal his arguments, but that he thinks the deciding factor is your intuitions. Now, what's really trippy here is on an atheist worldview, I don't think your intuitions are all that trustworthy, okay? But on a Christian worldview, when you look at this through the lens of Christianity and you interpret if Graham Oppy's correct in his conclusion there, then it would mean that there are people who have issues that are other than the argumentation, which are causing them to decide for God or against God. And that would be consistent with a relational choice about God. That underneath a lot of our argumentation is ultimately not just a bias, but potentially a relational decision we're making about God. And that's my interpretation of how I would do that. So what I'm saying is this: no matter how smart you are, you're stupid compared to God. And you may be still ultimately finally driven by things other than the intellect, other than the mind, things that relate to the heart. These things may ultimately be deciding where you land on these issues. Jesus kind of hints at this, where Jesus says that if anyone desires to know the truth, I'm paraphrasing here, I can't remember the exact words. If anyone desires to know the truth, then he'll come to me. If anyone wants the truth, he's going to come to me, which is a really bold statement. But it would be consistent with this observation that there's like something else inside of us that we're not really that good at identifying. So in the end, it's a worst case scenario, there's a tie along the evidence. Now, on the other hand, you have a brilliant guy like, say, Alvin Plantinga, who his statement about the non-believer, the atheist, is, look, now that was Graham Oppy's view. I'm taking if he's right, okay, because you mentioned Graham Oppy. But Alvin Plantinga, another brilliant theist, he would say he's right up there with Graham Oppy as far as clout and all that kind of stuff philosophically. But he would say that the reason why atheists seem to be turning from God is because something's wrong in their reasoning abilities. Like something's wrong with their thinking. And I laughed a little bit. I don't mean it to be rude. It's just crazy to hear this high-level conversations taking place. And I go, this is like totally consistent with basic Christian theology in my view. So don't be intimidated because smart people disagree. If every smart person disagrees with you, then that should make you wonder. But then there's other issues that go on. Knowledge puffs up. Things can cause arrogance. When you feel like you know a lot about something, you can get arrogant and proud and all those types of things. So Silas, I hope that helps, man. I hope that helps. Let me put it this way to you finally in the end. I think it's ridiculously obvious that God exists. I sincerely believe this. Really, I believe it. And it's possible that some of the really smart guys are just really good at talking themselves into believing all kinds of weird things. But it seems obvious that God exists, painfully obvious, and wonderfully obvious. And then the consistency, the evidence for Christianity, I think is so heavy and so strong. And then the complaints against it are usually nitpicky or misrepresentation, they fall into one of those two categories. This is nitpicky or it's misrepresentation. And so I look at that and I go, look, I'm convinced. Now, should I, with evidence and reason at my side and my life experience in Christ, should I ditch my faith because smart guy over here disagrees with me when there's another smart guy that disagrees with them and agrees with me? Like, no, it's not a good reason to ditch your faith or to doubt.
Okay, so that was not fun. Let's proceed through the salient points one clip at a time.
But you get guys like Graham Oppy. Now, why is it that I'm not stumbled anymore by this? Why does this not bother me that there's like a brilliant, brilliant man who's much smarter than me who is an atheist? I'll give you a few reasons. Graham Oppy, to take him as an example, he, to my knowledge, is not the kind of atheist that you're thinking of when most of us say like atheist. He actually thinks there are respectable arguments for God's existence. He just doesn't agree with them. In fact, I listened to a debate between Graham Oppy and, was it Ed Feser? It was on the ontological argument. I think it was Graham Oppy and Ed Feser. In this debate, it was really interesting as you listen to it. You would, most of us would listen and be like, I only understood like 8% of that. And that's fine. I don't mind listening when I don't understand all of a thing. That's kind of how I learn. You just keep listening, even though you don't quite get it all. But what was really interesting was how Graham Oppy says, at the end of the day, I'll summarize, I'll paraphrase for him. You can see the debate yourself, but he basically says, look, at the end of the day, I have an intuition against God and you have an intuition towards God. And that's that. That's it. Like, that's ultimately why I'm going to land on the atheist side. It's not because my arguments are better or stronger. It's because I have an intuition one way and you have an intuition the other way, which is really trippy because it means that him, this high up philosopher, wasn't like, I have these solid reasons why this is absolutely the case. Not that he doesn't try to marshal his arguments, but that he thinks the deciding factor is your intuitions.
So first, as far as I can tell, that's not what Oppy said in the discussion. I just listened in full to the Feser-Oppy discussion that Mike linked in the description, and I didn't hear anything resembling this comment. And just to be sure, I used a transcription software to transcribe the entire video and then combed through the script. The word intuition didn't even come up once, and a cognate of it only came up a single time when Oppy mentioned intuitionistic logic, which of course has nothing to do with what Mike attributes to Oppy. Moreover, Oppy only said the word against twice in the entire discussion, and they were completely irrelevant to what Mike attributes to Oppy. They had to do with mounting arguments against someone with confused or contradictory views. In fact, I even checked the other video Oppy did with Feser on capturing Christianity, which YouTube actually provided a transcript for, and again, the word intuition didn't even come up once in the discussion, and neither did any of its cognates. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that Mike just concocted this out of thin air. I'm simply saying that I wasn't able to verify this despite working extremely hard to do so. Second, what Mike says here runs very contrary to Oppy's general methodological approach in philosophy of religion. Oppy's atheism is not based on a quote-unquote intuition against God. It's based on comparing fully fleshed out theistic and atheistic theories in terms of their theoretical virtues. Roughly speaking, whichever theory best manages the trade-off between minimizing commitments and maximizing explanatory power is the one we should accept. And according to Oppy, naturalistic atheism best manages this trade-off. This is the reason why he's an atheist. It has nothing to do with an intuition against God. In fact, Oppy makes this point all the time, right? In his internet discussions, in his books, such as his 2013 book, The Best Argument Against God, and his recent debate book with Kenny Pierce entitled, Is There a God? A Debate. He even says this in the video that Mike points us to.
One thing that we can think about is, okay, so who's got the better theory? Right. I mean, this is not the only question that you could ask, but it's one question. Who's got the better theory? Now, I think that the way to answer that question is just to say, okay, the way that we do theory choice is we look to see which is the more virtuous theory. The way that we do that roughly is we look to see which theory manages the trade-off between minimising theoretical commitments and maximising explanatory breadth and depth. That's how you do theory choice. So if we're going to work out who's got the better view, it's going to be a kind of global thing that looks at global theoretical virtues.
So that's my second point. My third point is that an intuition against God, in ordinary parlance, sounds like a negative gut feeling directed towards God. Regardless of whether Mike intended it, saying this paints Oppy as if he's somehow deep down resistant to or opposed to God. It's some feeling or inclination that's opposed to God, that's against God. This is how we tend to use the word intuition in ordinary parlance, and adding the words against God seems to convey precisely this sort of opposition towards God. Needless to say, this is not true of Oppy, and it's not something that should be attributed to him. Of course, Winger might mean by intuition the philosopher's sense of a conscious state or event in which a proposition intellectually seems true upon grasping it. But if that's what Mike meant, then he should have specified that so as to cancel the ordinary language implication mentioned earlier, given that the ordinary language implication lends itself very easily to the negative caricature just mentioned. Again, I'm not saying that Mike intended to cast Oppy in this negative light. Rather, what I'm saying is that what Mike did say can easily have the effect of leading his audience to adopt this negative caricature. Anyway, with those 3 points covered, let's continue with Mike's video.
Now, what's really trippy here is on an atheist worldview, I don't think your intuitions are all that trustworthy, okay? But on a Christian worldview...
So, I'm not going to respond to this point since it wasn't defended in the video, but I can at least point you to my video, Over 100 Arguments for God Answered, wherein I systematically criticize this sort of reasoning.
But on a Christian worldview, when you look at this through the lens of Christianity and you interpret if Graham Oppy's correct in his conclusion there, then it would mean that there are people who have issues that are other than the argumentation, which are causing them to decide for God or against God. And that would be consistent with a relational choice about God. That underneath a lot of our argumentation is ultimately not just a bias, but potentially a relational decision we're making about God. And that's my interpretation of how I would do that. So what I'm saying is that
the first thing that I want to say in response to this is that we don't have control over our beliefs. And so painting this as a decision for or against God is mistaken, I think. I dare you, the audience, I dare you to just believe right now that Australia doesn't exist. Just do it, right? Believe Australia doesn't exist. Now, if you're like me, you find this demand utterly baffling, right? You can't just believe Australia doesn't exist. That's not something under your control. You just helplessly find yourself believing it based on your evidence and experiences. And if you didn't like that case, and if you're a Christian, I dare you to just believe in Hinduism right now, right? Just do it. Just believe in Hinduism. Make yourself believe it. Now, you can, of course, repeatedly think to yourself something like, Hinduism is true, Hinduism is true, Hinduism is true, Australia doesn't exist, Australia doesn't exist. But that, of course, doesn't amount to actually believing these things to be the case, right? Representing the world in these ways, or taking them to be the case. So I think it's pretty plausible that we don't have control over our beliefs. And importantly, once your belief in God goes out the door, it's not like you could then rationally choose to be in an explicit relationship with God, right? I mean, that's like asking Mike to choose to be in a relationship with Vishnu. It's not something he could rationally do in light of his current beliefs, over which he doesn't have control. Now, I actually think that some Christians probably have to paint atheism as a decision to have their eschatology make any sense. I mean, if you think that people could be punished simply because they don't believe a certain set of tenets, then it's natural to try to paint belief in those tenets as a choice, or at least belief as a function of some underlying choice. The moment you grant that someone can rationally become convinced that those tenets are false, through no choice of their own, but instead because of their evidence and experiences which have helplessly led them to disbelieve, the claim that such a person deserves punishment loses all of its plausibility, if, of course, it had any plausibility to begin with. This is actually why non-resistant non-belief is a very serious challenge to exclusivist religious views that require one to consciously believe certain tenets in order to avoid punishment in the afterlife. If you add in the obvious datum of non-resistant non-belief, punishment of said non-belief becomes unjust. Second, Mike's claim about relational decisions undergirding our argumentation might be true for some people, but it's doubtful that it's true for all people, and we don't have any reason to think it's specifically true of Graham Oppy. Again, I haven't even been able to confirm that Oppy even said what Winger alleged he said, but even if Oppy said it, he's almost certainly using the term intuition as it's used in philosophy, that is, as a conscious state or event in which a proposition strikes one as clearly true upon grasping it. This has nothing to do with some bias or a relational decision about God. It's entirely cognitive and intellectual in nature. So even if we grant that Oppy said what Mike attributed to him, we have no reason to think Oppy's atheism is due to some non-intellectual relational decision about God. Third, at least for many people, relational factors actually strongly tell against what their mind and intellect settle on. And such people don't fit Mike's apparent mold, according to which non-intellectual factors play a serious role in deciding where you land on these issues. Many non-theists desperately want God to exist, hope that he exists, hope that this broken world can be redeemed, that love and justice and mercy can prevail over the forces of evil and injustice. I've spoken to countless well-intentioned, reasonable, informed, reflective non-theists who expressly desire that God exists and want to believe in God, but simply find themselves unable because their evidence tells against it. I myself wish I could believe in God and hope that God exists, and yet I currently find my evidence and reasons for and against God's existence roughly counterbalanced, and as a result I find myself suspending judgment in whether God exists. So much is this true, in fact, that I say conditional prayers of the form, God, if you exist, please help me to grow in virtue and knowledge and love, and please help me to come to know you. This is eminently rational for agnostics. I mean, to give an analogy, if you were suspended on a desert island, and you knew that there was a serious chance that you could get help by shooting a flare into the sky, you'd clearly do it, right? It would be totally rational. And similarly, such conditional prayers are clearly rational for agnostics. But in addition to being rational, it represents a hope, a desire. And I'm not alone here. As I've said, I know countless people who are like me in this regard. Alex O'Connor actually put out a nice video on this a little while back, and let me see if I can fetch it for you.
I have, to put it mildly, been looking for God. I made a career out of engaging with religious arguments. At university, I visited numerous churches. I attended Bible groups. I read Athanasius and Anselm. I read Augustine and Aquinas. I looked in Julian of Norwich and Catherine of Siena. I looked at the sociological origin of religious belief in Durkheim and Marx and Freud and Jung. I looked at religious experience in William James and Rudolf Otto. I've looked in the modern works of people like Ed Feser and Bill Craig and Michael Murray and Richard Swinburne and Alvin Plantinga. I've looked in poetry. I've looked in the Psalms. I've looked in Job. I've looked in Ecclesiastes. I've looked in Dostoevsky. I read C.S. Lewis. I listened to worship music. I prayed. I studied the gospel. I even got an actual degree in theology from a university. And nothing, not once, not nearly, not ever, not even briefly have I experienced anything that speaks to the existence of a God in the universe.
The overarching point here is that countless people don't seem to fit Mike's apparent mold on which non-intellectual factors play a significant role in deciding where you land on these issues. Instead, for many people, non-intellectual factors decidedly pull against where they intellectually land on the matter. In fact, come to think of it, right, deconversion often seriously disrupts lives and families and communities. It induces extreme anxiety and depression in oneself and others. It even creates rifts among loved ones that never heal. It would be so easy to avoid this chaos and confusion and despair and heartbreak if one could simply choose to retain one's beliefs or choose to relationally engage with God in some way. The fact that people nevertheless find themselves amidst this chaos and heartbreak is good reason to think that these aren't choices. Fourth and finally, if underneath argumentation is a relational decision about God, this seems to spell as much disaster for Christians as it does atheists. Beliefs based on relational decisions are unreliable. They tend to be false. They don't track the truth well. We know this because of the panoply of mutually incompatible religious beliefs undergirding which are relational decisions. Or, more accurately, they're undergirded like that, at least according to what Mike is apparently putting forward here. So if this is the ultimate or primary basis for beliefs in this domain, if this is a huge factor that's settling where people land on the matter, then Christians should suspend their beliefs as well. So Mike's point here, therefore, does far more harm than good for the Christian.
No matter how smart you are, you're stupid compared to God. And you may be still ultimately finally driven by things other than the intellect, other than the mind, things that relate to the heart. These things may ultimately be deciding where you land on these issues.
So the first thing to say is that, again, as philosophers like Graham Oppy use the term intuition, they're intellectual or cognitive in nature, right? They're in the head. They're not in the heart, as I've explained earlier. Second, Oppy is quite explicit that it's the reasons that convince him. Indeed, he's recounted his life story many times on various different channels. He grew up as a Christian, and it was only after engaging in debates and discussions about religion and God's existence that he left Christianity, as the reasons against it struck him as more convincing. Third, Winger says that things other than the intellect, other than the mind, but instead factors relating to the heart, may be deciding where you land on these issues. Notice that he says this may be the case. Now, as a matter of pure possibility, yeah, I guess it may be the case. But also, equally, it may not be the case. Unless you have evidence of bad motives or bad relational decisions, it's probably not good to speculate about that. Fourth, and once again, this point about the heart cuts both ways. It'll spell disaster for Christians too. The heart isn't reliable, as shown by the myriad mutually inconsistent beliefs engendered by following the heart. Fifth and finally, it's hard for me to see Mike's video here as anything other than the Christian equivalent of new atheists saying that smart Christians may believe because of wishful thinking. At least on its face, it's an attempt to discredit the epistemic significance of disagreement among rational parties. If you can paint the disagreeing parties as likely or potentially motivated by things other than the mind or intellect or reason, their arguments and divergent conclusions become much less threatening.
In the end, it's worst case scenario, there's a tie along the evidence. Now, on the other hand,
So I didn't quite get this point where he said the worst case scenario, there's a tie among the evidence. Oppy wasn't saying that there's a tie among the evidence. He definitely thinks global theory comparison reveals that atheism is the best theory. He doesn't think the evidence is tied. Second, if the evidence is tied, then at least in terms of rational normativity, you shouldn't be a Christian. You should suspend judgment. If the evidence is tied for and against free trade as the best path to economic prosperity, you shouldn't then believe either way. You should instead suspend judgment on whether it's the best path to economic prosperity. So this quote-unquote worst-case scenario, which he's trying to say still helps his case, doesn't help his case at all. In this quote-unquote worst-case scenario, at least in terms of rational normativity, you should not be a Christian.
you have a brilliant guy like, say, Alvin Plantinga, who his statement about the non-believer, the atheist, is, look, now that was Graham Oppy's view. I'm taking if he's right, okay, because you mentioned Graham Oppy. But Alvin Plantinga, another brilliant theist, he would say he's right up there with Graham Oppy as far as clout and all that kind of stuff philosophically. But he would say that the reason why atheists seem to be turning from God is because something's wrong in their reasoning abilities. Like something's wrong with their thinking. And I laughed a little bit. I don't mean it to be rude. It's just crazy to hear this high-level conversations taking place. And I go, this is like totally consistent with basic Christian theology in my view.
So, firstly, I mean, we should just notice that he says atheists are turning away from God. I mean, that, of course, makes it sound like it's like a conscious choice that they're making, that they are turning their backs on God and walking away. But again, as I've explained earlier, your beliefs on this matter aren't choices. They're not under your control. And again, as I pointed out, at least some Christians need to paint it as a choice so that they can justify punishing people in the afterlife based on their beliefs. That would be unjust if we don't have control over our beliefs. What's more, Mike Winger here punts to what Alvin Plantinga says. Now, at least as Mike Winger described it here, what he said is ambiguous. It could mean either that atheists made some mistake somewhere in their thinking or in their reasoning, or it could mean that they genuinely have some sort of cognitive impairment or deficit with respect to their rational capacities. If it's the former, if that's what we mean, well, then the fact that Plantinga says this is just trivial. I mean, of course, a theist is going to think that the atheist has made a mistake somewhere in their thinking. This just follows from the fact that theists and atheists disagree, right? Minimally, the theist thinks the atheist is mistaken in believing God doesn't exist. By the same token, of course, the atheist thinks the theist has made a mistake somewhere in their thinking. Again, at least minimally in thinking God exists. By contrast, if it's the latter, if we're saying that atheists genuinely have some sort of cognitive impairment or deficit with respect to their rational capacities, well then there's literally no evidence to suggest that this is true, and it's honestly kind of comical to say it. What's more, the atheist could say with equal legitimacy, that is, no legitimacy at all, that the Christian has some sort of cognitive impairment or deficit. Overall, though, it's best to avoid such ludicrously uncharitable accusations on both sides.
Yeah, so don't be intimidated because smart people disagree. If every smart person disagrees with you, then that should make you wonder. But
So that was really strange. Like, why is it only worrying if every single smart person disagrees with you? Surely it should also be worrying if there's massive disagreement on the matter among the relevant experts who have studied this topic their entire lives and who know much more about the topic than you. And by you there, I mean the universal you. I'm not using it here to refer specifically to Mike. So to draw this point out, imagine that you are a freshman philosophy student. Okay, in the final week of your intro philosophy class, you cover the debate about whether time is a substance or merely a relation between events. After reading a couple papers and after attending a couple lectures, you become absolutely convinced that time is a substance. But now imagine that you learn that there's fierce, lively debate and disagreement over this topic among the expert professional philosophers of time who specialize on it. And imagine further that neither view is clearly dominant among this class of experts. Upon learning this, I think it's obvious that you should at least significantly decrease your confidence in your conclusion. After all, these people are smarter and more well-read than you, and indeed they've studied this topic their whole lives and written books and papers on it, and yet they don't agree on the matter. Moreover, within this group of professional philosophers, the opponents of your view have written extensively criticizing the reasons and arguments that led you to your view. And you haven't even come close to even reading their responses, let alone formulating cogent counter-responses and seeing whether they can rebut your counter-responses. It is totally intellectually irresponsible, then, to maintain your super high confidence in light of all these facts. What's more, now that you've become aware of this huge and ever-blossoming debate among the relevant experts, you're now aware that there are tons of arguments against your view of which you weren't even aware, and also lots of responses to your favorite arguments of which you weren't aware. This too should considerably decrease your confidence in your view. But notice that this is exactly the case for most people with respect to philosophy of religion. Most people aren't among the experts in philosophy of religion, and there's a raging debate among such experts as to whether God exists. There are thousands of papers and books and responses of which the vast majority of people aren't even aware. For them to maintain a super high confidence upon learning these facts strikes me as the height of intellectual irresponsibility.
Yeah, I think there's other issues that go on. Knowledge puffs up. Things can cause arrogance. When you feel like you know a lot about something, you can get arrogant and proud, and all those types of things. So Silas, I hope that helps, man. I hope that helps.
Again, this applies to both atheists and theists, right? Any reason to think atheistic belief among these experts is due to arrogance, to however large an extent, is also a reason to think theistic belief among these experts is due to arrogance. So this doesn't constitute a reason to discount the epistemic significance of expert atheist philosophers who disagree with you. And for very many such atheist philosophers, we have good reason to think that they're not arrogant by the lights of firstly, their testimony, secondly, their behavior, thirdly, the way that they cast their conclusions, the way that they cast their assessments, the way that they interact with people, their behavior. We have all the behavioral evidence we could want for them not being arrogant in this manner. For many of them, we have all the behavioral and testimonial evidence that we could wish for thinking that they aren't arrogant or prideful in this kind of way. And finally, if you want to say that, oh, there's some sort of secret arrogance or pride of which they aren't aware, again, that's not going to be a symmetry breaker that discounts their disagreement with respect to your disagreement with them, because you may also have that kind of secret arrogance or something along those lines that is producing your belief. So again, we haven't made any headway here in discounting the epistemic significance of expert atheist philosophers who disagree with you.
Let me put it this way to you finally in the end. I think it's ridiculously obvious that God exists. I sincerely believe this. Really, I believe it. And it's possible that some of the really smart guys are just really good at talking themselves into believing all kinds of weird things. But it seems obvious that God exists, painfully obvious, and wonderfully obvious.
Okay, so I'm not going to question his testimony about what he takes to be obvious to him, though if I'm extending this trust to him, I equally expect him to extend his trust to non-theists who testify that their non-theism is mostly due to reasons for not believing in God, rather than some willful rejection of relationship with God. So anyway, I'll grant that God's existence seems obvious to him. The problem, though, is that to boatloads of people, including most professional philosophers, God's existence is nowhere near obvious. In fact, God's non-existence is obvious to many people. When there's significant divergence between senses of obviousness among people who seem equally well positioned on the matter, why would you trust your own sense of obviousness? What makes you so special? That just seems intolerably arbitrary by my lights. Now, if I'm reporting on my own senses of obviousness, neither God's existence nor God's non-existence strike me as obvious. I do admit, though, that specific tenets of some traditional brands of Christianity strike me as obviously false. It strikes me as obviously false that a morally perfect being could command people to brutally slaughter men, women, and children. It strikes me as blatantly obvious that a perfectly loving being couldn't drown babies and children in a worldwide or even local flood. Which is, by the way, one of the most painful ways to die. It also strikes me as obviously false that a perfect being could superintend the eternal conscious torment of humans because they weren't convinced of arguments for God's existence, and so on down the list. Mike also says it's possible that they have talked themselves out of the obvious. Well, for starters, many of them didn't even start out believing in God, so they never really even had the belief to begin with. They didn't even have the sense of obviousness to begin with, and so Mike's point here doesn't obviously apply to them. Secondly, it's equally possible that Mike has talked himself into his sense of obviousness. In other words, it's equally possible that various non-truth tracking processes have led to Mike's sense of obviousness. Without some actual evidence, one way or another, it's just arbitrary to then discount their reports on what seems obvious, while affording yours all the credence in the world. And setting aside that this point equally afflicts Mike and theists, that they might have talked themselves into their sense of obviousness, again, it's just not going to cut it to say that, oh, it's at least possible that they've talked themselves out of the obvious. You need to actually give some reasons or some evidence to think that is, in fact, the case, if you want to discount the epistemic significance of their disagreement.
And then the consistency, the evidence for Christianity, I think is so heavy and so strong. And then the complaints against it are usually nitpicky or misrepresentation. They fall into one of those two categories. This is nitpicky or it's misrepresentation. And so I look at that and I go, look, I'm convinced. Now, should I, with evidence and reason it myself?
Yeah, so now we're just talking about the first order evidential considerations. He doesn't present them in his video, but simply asserts that they're good and that responses are bad. So there isn't much to interact with here, other than to point out that other people who have studied this far longer than Mike and me, and who know much more about it than Mike and me, disagree with Mike's assessment here. So we're still left with this higher order evidence of disagreement, and Mike has done absolutely nothing to discount its force.
Side, in my life experience in Christ, should I ditch my faith because smart guy over here disagrees with me when there's another smart guy that disagrees with them and agrees with me. Like, nah, it's not a good reason to ditch your faith or to doubt.
So I'm not here to tell anyone to ditch their faith. I'm more concerned with the rationally appropriate response to the evidence of massive disagreement among the relevant experts when oneself is not among said experts. It strikes me as clear as day that one should, at minimum, seriously diminish one's confidence when presented with this higher order evidence. This doesn't imply that you should give up your view. Instead, it's a point about the firmness with which you hold your view. Of course, it might lead you to give up your view if the hit in confidence is so large as to render agnosticism the rationally appropriate response, but also it might not. That just depends on where you are on the epistemic landscape. But as I've pointed out, the considerations that Mike adduced in this video in support of his conclusion there at the end that this shouldn't be worrying to Christians or that this shouldn't cause them to doubt in some manner, those considerations fail. They don't succeed. By my lights, Mike has drastically failed to discount the epistemic significance of disagreement, massive disagreement among the relevant experts on this topic. Anyway, that's going to conclude this video. I hope you can see now why I was prompted to respond to Mike's video. Whether Mike intends it or not, his video might be perpetuating potentially harmful caricatures about non-theists, and it also contains some subpar epistemology to boot. In light of that, I think a response video was warranted. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was edifying and helped increase your intellectual empathy for people with opposing views. If so, please smash that like button, subscribe, turn on that little bell for notifications, consider supporting me on Patreon or a one-time donation. Links to both of those are in the description. And as always, what better way to end it there than I'm Joe Schmid, this is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.